June 1972, Pennsylvania coal country. 41 Caterpillar D8 bulldozers are sitting on a strip mine when Hurricane Agnes turns the site into moving ground. By the time crews understand what the spoil is doing under the tracks, the mine is no longer a job site. It is swallowing its own machines. To understand why 41 Caterpillar D8s ended up buried on a Pennsylvania strip mine in June of 1972, you have to begin with the ground long before the flood. The machines did not simply disappear because too much rain fell. They were caught at the meeting point of mining geometry, saturated spoil, steep Appalachian drainage, and one of the most destructive storms in Eastern American history. The site lay in the anthracite and bituminous coal country of Pennsylvania, where strip mining had already reshaped entire hillsides by the early 1970s. This was not stable ground in any natural sense. A strip mine is built by removal, not by permanence. Overburden is cut away, spoil is cast aside, benches are opened, haul roads are carved into slopes, and drainage is constantly being altered by excavation. What looks solid from a distance can be a temporary working surface laid over fractured rock, loose fill, and water channels that did not exist a season earlier. That mattered because the Caterpillar D8 was built for force, not flotation. In the early 1970s, depending on exact configuration, a D8 could weigh well over 50 tons with blade and ripper fitted, and it carried that weight through a track system designed to spread load better than wheels, but not to defeat collapsing spoil or moving slurry. On firm ground, the machine was exactly what a strip mine needed. It could cut roads, push spoil, maintain benches, clear slides, and keep production moving in conditions that stopped lighter equipment cold. On unstable, saturated ground, that same mass became a liability. A machine built to hold a grade could become part of the grade when the grade itself started to move. By June 1972, Hurricane Agnes was already turning that risk into reality across Pennsylvania. Agnes made landfall on the Gulf Coast as a hurricane, crossed the eastern United States, and then re-intensified as a rain disaster over the mid-Atlantic and Northeast. In Pennsylvania, the storm was less a wind event than a water event. Rain fell into watersheds that were already wet. Creeks rose into rivers. Rivers spread into towns. Mine cuts filled. Sediment ponds overtopped. Access roads softened. Drainage ditches that had handled ordinary runoff were suddenly carrying violent brown water loaded with coal fines, rock, timber, and debris. At many industrial sites, crews had enough warning to shut down operations. What they did not have was any reliable way to predict exactly how a worked mine landscape would react once the rain totals crossed the line from severe weather into regional hydrologic failure. That is the difference that matters in this story. The D8s were not buried by a simple flood in the ordinary sense. They were overtaken by a site-wide ground failure caused by water moving through disturbed earth on a scale the mine had not been built to resist. On paper, a large strip operation could justify a fleet of that size. 41 Caterpillar D8s was an enormous concentration of heavy tractors, but not an impossible one for a major coal property running multiple cuts, spoil pushes, road maintenance lines, and reclamation tasks at once. These were the workhorses of the site. Some would have been assigned to active stripping zones, others to spoil bank shaping, drainage work, and support operations. In dry weather, they represented control, steel, diesel, torque, and track, the ability to impose order on blasted rock and overburden. But the mine itself had its own hidden clock. Every bench, spoil pile, and haul road depended on water staying where the engineers expected it to stay. Once that changed, the entire logic of the site changed with it. Mechanically, the problem was this. Strip mine spoil is not undisturbed earth. It is blasted, broken, and repositioned material with voids, weak zones, and irregular compaction. Under prolonged rainfall, water penetrates into those spaces, raises pore pressure, reduces shear strength, and turns what had behaved like a stable working surface into something closer to a moving mass. The machine does not need to be driving fast for that to become fatal. It only needs to be parked, or operating on ground that is quietly losing its structure from below. That is why operators in mining country learn to read more than just the weather. They watch the roads, they watch the ditch lines, they watch whether the tracks leave crisp marks or wet shine. They watch whether a spoil bank starts slowing at the toe. They listen for the subtle change between solid push resistance and dead drag. Because when saturated spoil begins to move, the warning can come in small signs first: a shallow rut that fills too quickly, a bench edge that sheds material in thin sheets, water seeping where no seep was visible the day before. Back at the Pennsylvania mine, those signs were being overwhelmed by scale. Agnes was delivering rainfall measured not in inconvenience but in system failure. Across parts of the state, totals climbed into the double digits. Valleys flooded. Coal country streams became conveyors of mud and wreckage. In stripped terrain, runoff accelerated fast because the vegetation and root structure that slow natural hillsides had already been removed or disturbed. Water concentrated, cut new channels, undercut roads, and loaded spoil masses until gravity took over. Then the margin disappeared. Some of the D8s were likely shut down where they had last been working, staged on benches or near operating areas with the expectation that crews would return when the storm passed. That decision would have made sense under ordinary conditions. Moving a machine of that size during worsening visibility, softening roads, and active runoff can create its own danger. But that decision only makes sense if the ground remains ground. It did not remain ground. What happened next was not a single dramatic moment visible from one camera angle. It was a chain reaction across a worked landscape. Water overtopped drainage paths. Spoil banks failed. Mud and rock began moving downslope. Benches disappeared under sliding overburden. Machines that had been left on apparently usable surfaces were engulfed, shoved sideways, or dropped as the material beneath them liquefied and shifted. Some would have been buried where they sat. Others may have been carried short distances, rolled or pinned under collapsing spoil. A 50-ton tractor is enormous until an entire hillside starts moving with it. And once that started, recovery was no longer a matter of simply pulling out stuck equipment. The site had become something else entirely. The problem was no longer production. It was access, stability, and survival. By the time the rain eased, the mine was not a job site in any normal sense. It was a damaged landscape of collapsed spoil, broken drainage, flooded cuts, and buried equipment. Roads that had carried service trucks and fuel wagons were gone or cut through by washouts. Bench lines that had defined the working geometry of the pit had been erased. In places, the ground had settled into heavy mud. In others, it had hardened around debris and steel into something closer to a landslide deposit than a recoverable work surface. That is the point where the number begins to matter. One buried dozer is an incident. 41 Caterpillar D8s buried across a strip mine is an industrial collapse. It means the failure was not local. It means the entire operating logic of the site was overwhelmed at once. To understand why recovery became so difficult, the reason matters. A bulldozer stuck in ordinary mud can sometimes be extracted by force. Another dozer, a winch tractor, a cable rig, or later a crane can often solve the problem if the machine is still structurally accessible and the ground around it can support the recovery equipment. A bulldozer buried in failed spoil is a different problem. The machine may be under tons of unstable overburden. Its track frames may be twisted by side load. The blade may be pinned. The cab may be crushed or packed solid with mud and rock. Most important, the ground above and around it may still be moving. Mechanically, recovery crews face three separate risks at once. First, the buried machine may no longer be in one clean pull path. Second, the recovery machine may sink or trigger another slide before rigging is even attached. Third, every hour of delay allows saturated spoil to settle, compact, and lock the buried equipment deeper into place. What begins as a recovery can turn into excavation, and excavation in unstable mine ground is slow, dangerous work. That is why many machines lost in floods, slides, and spoil failures are not recovered immediately, even when their value is obvious. The obstacle is not desire. It is safe access. At the Pennsylvania site, crews would first have had to answer a more basic question. Where exactly were all 41 tractors, and which of them could even be reached without risking more men and more equipment? Some machines were probably visible at first only by partial shapes: a blade corner above the mud, a track grouser line, the top of a fuel tank. Others may have vanished completely under spoil that had moved tens of feet across benches and into cuts. Once rainwater, silt, coal fines, and broken overburden settle together, they do not behave like clean fill. They harden irregularly. They trap water in pockets. They conceal voids. A surface that looks ready to carry a recovery tractor can collapse under load with almost no warning. On paper, a Caterpillar D8 represented a major capital asset. In practice, after burial and mine spoil, each machine had to be judged one by one. Was it intact? Was the engine submerged? Had the final drives been crushed? Was the frame bent beyond economical repair? Could a path be cut to it? Could the site support the cranes, tractors, or dragline support needed to lift or pull it? And even if the answer to all of those questions was yes, one final question remained. Was recovery worth more than replacement in a mine district already crippled by regional flood damage? That calculation is colder than the machine deserves, but it is how these decisions are made. Floods do not just damage equipment, they damage budgets, schedules, roads, fuel supply, labor availability, and the financial confidence of the entire operation. Hurricane Agnes did that across Pennsylvania on a statewide scale. Mines, towns, rail lines, bridges, and processing infrastructure were hit together. In that environment, a buried dozer was not evaluated in isolation. It was part of a broader question of whether the site itself could return to service soon enough to justify the effort. Then came the second consequence. Water does not leave a strip mine cleanly after a disaster. It keeps working after the storm is over. Saturated slopes continue to creep. Seepage continues through spoil. Drainage channels keep cutting. Material that held through the peak may fail days later. That means the post-storm recovery window is deceptive. The sky can clear while the ground is still unstable enough to kill. Now back to the machines. The D8s that could not be reached quickly were effectively written out of the first phase of recovery. Crews would have focused first on reopening access roads, stabilizing drainage, and protecting any remaining active structures from further washout. Only after the site stopped deteriorating could buried equipment even be assessed in a meaningful way. By then, some of the tractors would already have been too deep, too damaged, or too dangerous to justify extraction. That is how machine graveyards are created, not by a dramatic decision in one moment, but by a sequence of practical decisions under pressure. This one can be saved. That one cannot be reached. That one is under a spoil mass still taking water. That one would require more equipment than the machine is worth. That one stays where it is. For the operators and mechanics, that kind of loss is different from ordinary wear or even ordinary accident damage. These were not machines that had simply reached the end of service life. They had been swallowed by the site they were built to control. A D8 was supposed to be the answer to bad ground, bad weather, and heavy material. At this mine, the scale of the failure exceeded the machine's category of strength entirely. The aftermath carried beyond the equipment count. Buried tractors meant interrupted stripping schedules, delayed reclamation, lost production, and a longer reconstruction of the mine's drainage and bench system. Every missing machine reduced the site's ability to repair itself. That is one of the harshest operational ironies in heavy equipment history. When a disaster buries enough machinery, it also buries the tools needed to undo the disaster. In the years that followed, Hurricane Agnes remained one of the defining flood events in Pennsylvania history. Entire communities remembered the storm through washed-out streets, drowned basements, collapsed bridges, and river marks on buildings. In mining country, some of its most severe effects were less visible to the public. They remained out on worked ground in spoil banks and cuts, where buried steel marked the exact places where the site had crossed from operation into failure. The machines are gone from the bench lines now, or hidden beneath reworked ground, reclamation, erosion, and time. But the lesson remains clear. On paper, the Caterpillar D8 had the weight, blade force, and durability to dominate a strip mine. On the ground, none of that mattered once water changed the structure of the mine itself. The dozers were not defeated by lack of power. They were defeated by saturated spoil, collapsed drainage, and a landscape that stopped behaving like land. That is why this story still matters. It is not just about 41 buried tractors. It is about the moment an industrial site lost control of its own terrain. And it would not be the last time heavy machines in America were left trapped, buried, or abandoned when ground, weather, and time turned against them.